and welcome to the AT&T CyberThreat Report for April 19th, 2012. Joining us today, we have John Hogoboom. John Hogoboom is a security analyst and a botnet tracker. And John, what do you plan to discuss with us today?
Well, I'm going to talk about a particular botnet that we've been kind of become aware of, and how it's kind of manifested and the membership of it, which is a little interesting. It actually ties into your Internet Weather Report, I think. So we'll take a look at that one real quickly.
I think that's going to be a pretty good discussion. And today we have I'll describe him as a guest, not really a guest to our team, but certainly a guest to the program here, Jim Boxmeyer. I understand you have a little bit of a new position in the organization. Tell us about yourself.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm leading the AT&T Cyber Intelligence, Emerging Threats, and Incident Response teams. So we're going to be trying to build a little more intelligence on the emerging threats and leverage them forward to the rest of the company.
Sounds really good, Jim, and that's I think that's going to be very valuable, and certainly ties in closely with the program that we're providing here. That is, our hope is to get more information and understanding of security threats out to the customer base and actually to the internet in general. So, and I understand you're going to talk with us a little bit about a topic today.
So yeah, we've been seeing a lot of growth out in the world on in hacking embedded systems. They're predicting like 100 million TVs will be on the internet by 2016, and right now there's very little protection on any of those devices.
I think that'll be a good discussion, and as I mentioned to you earlier, we sort of introduced your latest blog last week, and hopefully we can have a little discussion on the content of that blog, and that should be really good. We also have with us today Jim Clausing. Jim is a key member of our malware analysis team. He does other types of security analysis as well. Welcome, Jim. And do you have something to discuss with us today?
Yeah, Brian, I want to briefly mention an ongoing SQL injection attack that has hit several 100,000 websites, and it's kind of getting some attention today, so I thought we probably should mention it here.
All right, sounds like a good idea. And I'm Brian Rexroad. I'll cover the internet weather today, and I think we have a couple of interesting topics to discuss on that weather report. So, with further ado, I want to first of all make sure that you have our contact information. If you'd like to contact us, please contact us on email at cyberthreat@list.att.com, and you can also follow a number of us on Twitter. My handle is Brian Rexroad. John Hogoboom is new to Twitter. He's got a handle John Hogoboom. Jim Clausing has been around on Twitter for a while. He also has a handle J Clausing. And I've also included Jim Boxmeyer's Twitter handle as well, which is J Boxmeyer. So please feel free to follow us if you have interest. And certainly this is one mechanism that we provide notification that this program has been posted. And then certainly I'll plug our blog. There are a number of us that have blog articles out on the Networking Exchange blog at att.com. Feel free to take a look at that. And last but not least, there is a channel for the AT&T Tech channel on Facebook. Go ahead and search for the AT&T Tech channel on Facebook, and you'll be able to find that channel. The next thing I wanted to mention here as well is that we are aware, actually this got attention through a blog on the internet. There was a recent email phishing event that took place. This was an event where emails were sent actually deliberately not to AT&T email accounts. They were actually deliberately sent to other accounts on the internet. I'll just pick out a couple of random examples. For example, they might have been sent to a Comcast account or a Gmail account, for example. They weren't sent to AT&T.net accounts. And so that was a deliberate attempt to make us a little bit blind to the event. But in any case, they purported to be from AT&T. They were not from AT&T. These were generally emails that mentioned that your wireless bill is ready. It generally said that the bill was actually quite high, on the order of about $1,000 or so. So that was intended to grab some attention. But the links that were in that email did not point to AT&T. They actually pointed to other places, and there was malware associated with that. So Certainly, we recognize this event. Unfortunately, it was more difficult for us to recognize it because it went sent to other organizations as opposed to through our own accounts. But we're looking at ways to improve that in the future, not just for AT&T, but for other industries as well. And there is information about how to protect yourself from phishing. There's a knowledge article on the AT&T website, and I've got a link to it here. And in particular, if you do a search on phishing that is spelled with a PH as opposed to with an F, you can find a lot of good information about how to protect yourself from phishing attacks. So certainly, one of the obvious things is to make sure that in any email that you receive that you're skeptical of the source, particularly if there are any tips associated with it that might make it look suspect, and make sure you're following links that point to places that you would expect. And if there's any question about that, certainly just ignore the links in the email, go directly to the website so that you're aware of and you've used in the past before providing any login information or any personal information whatsoever. And make sure that that site is protected with SSL, that it shows the little key lock icon on your web browser. Some browsers show it a little bit differently.
And I would just add one thing, Brian, in that, this isn't, I cover the spam report quite a bit. I haven't done it in a few weeks. Maybe we'll do it next time. And this isn't very different at all from what I've reported on before with other real notable brands like FedEx and UPS or United States Postal Service, or I'm sure there's others I'm forgetting. But the tactic they're doing here is they're trying to find a company that a lot of people have an established relationship with so that it's plausible that whoever's receiving it is going to open it and say, oh, wait, I do have AT&T service, or I do use FedEx or UPS. Is this, and then they have to question themselves, whether it's a legitimate email or not. So as Brian said, be cautious about any types of phishing attempts, particularly since we've seen ones like this past one, which actually did lead you to malware if you clicked in it. So just be careful.
Yeah, oftentimes if it's too good to be true, don't click on it, but be careful. If it's too bad to be plausible, be careful on clicking as well. If it's completely out of the norm.
So let's get into our actual topics for today, and I'll go ahead and pass the reins here to John Hogoboom. And John, it sounds like there's some botnet activity that we've got a little bit of a insight into here.
Yes. So for the past few weeks now, we've been talking about some scanning activity on port 210 TCP. I think you'll probably bring up a chart on it later in the Internet Weather Report. And I took a look at this in a little bit more detail. This is the memberships that we're seeing. What we're seeing is around anywhere from like 1,200 up into the 3,500 or so engaging in this activity. So I did two things over the past week. The first thing I did is I wanted to take a look at who are these devices that are engaging in this scanning. So we're pretty sure it's botnet related. Because the activity is so coordinated. It starts and stops very regularly, so all these units are receiving instructions at a single time and engaging in the scanning behavior, and then they stop. And then they'll engage in it again and stop. So I took a look at the actual devices that we're seeing scanning, and it was interesting. The majority of these are webcams. All of them, from what I'm able to tell, are some type of embedded device. So I'm not going to mention any names here because I think we're probably going to want to try to reach out to some of these vendors and try to figure out if there's some kind of vulnerability that's out there. I'm not sure if these webcam vendors are vulnerable, have some vulnerability, and they're being hacked and turned into bots, or if it's that whoever's setting these up and deploying them are just leaving default passwords in there or choosing poor passwords. So I'm not sure which is the case here. But doing a little probing, we're actually able to see that the majority fall into two vendors here. About, 36% or so are the two different webcam vendors engaging in this, acting as bots, engaging in this port 210 TCP scanning activity. And then actually before we were able to right before we started recording here, I was doing some more analysis, trying to get more data, and I wasn't able to update my chart. but I was able to determine about 4 to 5% of the ones that were in this kind of no response are actually listening on a different port other than, they might be listening on port 8080, or I saw some listening on port 88. And they are, most of these ones are another type of embedded device. It was a SIP VoIP gateway. So not a huge number of them, but again, another embedded device, a SIP VoIP gateway in that case. The thing I would like to point out, though, is that a lot of these turned out to be webcams. So someone's really interested in harvesting embedded webcam devices that people put either in their businesses or in their home, and they expose them to the internet, and they've figured out a way to get into them and use them for their own purposes. So we have at least 7 different types of webcams mixed in here. I did see a couple of DSL modems, another type of embedded device. I also saw some network-attached storage devices, which is another embedded type of device. That's not necessarily part of a computer. It's just a device that you might stick on the network and hook up to a network connection. So the next thing I did is I looked at, well, what are these 210 TCP connections? What are they looking for? And I'm still on the fence. I don't have an answer to what it is. I can tell you one thing. The official port for 210 TCP is a protocol called ANSI Z39.50, which is a WAIS. I think it's Wide Area Information Server or something for library systems. We talked about this before. Whatever these conversations going on port 210 TCP with these devices and what they're scanning for, it's not that. I looked at that protocol. I made sure that what I'm seeing protocol-wise is not the same thing. These things are responding with a 32-byte MD5 looking checksum, and they don't say anything else. I don't know what it means or what it is. If anybody knows, I'd certainly like to find out. But it certainly looks like there's some kind of botnet thing going on here. A lot of the members are webcams. If they're not a webcam, there's some other type of embedded device. So lastly, just one thing, and we kind of talk about this all the time. If you do have devices that you're going to expose to the internet, filter or block access to them if you can. I have a feeling there might be people who just don't realize that when they put their camera on the internet, maybe they don't even care if people could see it or get access to it, but just be careful. It is a device. It's a computer, and people can possibly break into it and use it for their own purposes and not just look at whatever the camera is pointing at. You might be able to do more with it because a lot of these are embedded Linux. They have a lot more functionality than just being a camera. If you do use them and you need to expose them to the internet, please try to create complex passwords. Do not use the default. I know that some of these out there are using default passwords. Another thing that people aren't usually really mindful of, this includes your routers like your D-Link or Linksys routers, any other types of embedded devices. Make sure you check pretty often to patch the firmware and software on there. They do fix bugs pretty frequently. I don't know why this botnet is created is because of a bug or vulnerability in unpatched devices, or if it's poor password practice, like I said. But just to be safe, always try to keep up on patching these devices. It's easy to forget. Your Windows machine is always going to check every Tuesday on Microsoft Tuesday at the beginning of the month to look for new patches. But your embedded device, chances are, is not going to, and years could go by before it gets patched. And then if you can, one last thing that I recommend is to log and monitor activity to any devices that are exposed to the internet for any kind of anomalous activity, especially if you're a business or corporation. For the home user, that might be a little more tricky unless you're into that kind of thing, such as some of us on the program here would be. But that's always a good recommendation, to look for anybody who might be trying to break into it or gain access to it in an unauthorized manner. And that's all I have at the moment. A little bit more information on this activity than we had last week. Still not clear what relation there is to the 210 TCP. I suspect it might be related somehow to some kind of communication between the bots in a command and control fashion, but this is just a hunch right now. I don't have any concrete evidence on that.
Well, obviously some very good development here, and I don't know, is this a good segue to get into some additional discussion here, Jim Boxmeyer, about embedded devices and such?
I think so. I think we can kind of take it into the next level, and that's where we start looking at consumer devices. And, they've got these TVs out now that are, smart-enabled. They've got cameras in them. They actually can be controlled through motion. They can record programs based upon facial recognition, so they assign users and use biometrics. But you really don't hear much about security for them, patching for them. What happens if it gets hacked? Do you call Samsung and they come out with a security technician to forensics your television? And it's kind of a concerning thing because they're marketing this to home users who really are not considering security for their television, connecting them to the internet, and you're really counting on a home firewall, but you also don't know what that TV is connecting outbound with and what it's allowing back in through that tunnel. I don't have one at home at the current time. Maybe the TVs are using port 210 for a lot of their connections and access. That may be your missing device shot. It's possible.
Certainly that possibility, although we haven't seen any evidence of that specific thing, but I think your point is well made. That is, whether it be an industrial device. In fact, there's obviously a lot of controversy. We've discussed this before. In fact, I think it was the last time you joined us about the notion of SCADA and more generically industrial control systems. If you think of it as in the business enterprise and the security controls that need to be put around industrial control systems, but the same issue applies right to consumer devices, be it a television or a webcam as we're looking at here. We absolutely need to be raising awareness of the needs from a security standpoint here. And, obviously, the folks that are watching this program are probably preaching to the choir in some respects, but I think we all own some responsibility to try to get more awareness around these types of topics. And, I guess, Jim, perhaps you and I can do some things to try to get some things and actually invite anybody here to try to use, a more commonly used social and networking mechanism like Facebook to try to get more information about this type of thing. When
you go in to talk to the person selling you the device, ask them about the security of it. Make them go back to the vendor and say, well, how do we secure these devices? You see it on the smart meters now, but you've got, it's going so much wider than that. You've got refrigerators that literally will keep an inventory of everything that goes in and out. They can scan them in and outbound. But it's the media devices that are really going to be what's going to be the next generation of this, and the smart home devices where you can watch your TV or you watch your house through your TV. Well, other people can also connect into your TV and watch your house through it. Or watch you through it, or record you on it, and things like that. So there's a lot of privacy concerns. SCADA was one of the other issues that we're concerned with. But I had an interesting conversation with a vendor who produces some of these embedded controller devices where it's basically Linux on a chip. Mm-hmm. And they say, well, we started with a secure version of Linux. We put it on this chip. People can't access the chip. Well, that's not true. A lot of the people who are doing the research on this will actually take the device apart. They'll attach electrodes to the chip to be able to pull and essentially dump the data off of that chip, and then they do it through a decoder, find out where the weaknesses are, and then they can hit it from the network connections. And the vendor was actually very surprised that anybody would actually spend a couple $100 on a device to take it apart and do this testing. And I said, well, that's kind of the mindset of the security researcher. That's what they buy the device intentionally to do. And then once the papers are published, pretty much anybody can take advantage of that exploit.
Well, and I think the evidence of that kind of activity, not directly related, but very closely related, there have been disassembled versions of the iPhone posted on the Internet well before the iPhone's ever been released. And, for each version, and they have a lot of analysis, conjecture about how the technology was created and how it involved. And that's just what's been posted on the Internet and, in a public domain. So, absolutely, there are folks, they're out there purchasing devices for the purpose of reverse engineering and to, find out how they can take advantage of these devices. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think we're going to see this area grow in security over the next few years, though, because we've all been very focused. I know I've been very focused on the mobility space as we get more and more mobility devices on the internet. And as those devices get closer and closer to a true IP device and not a tunnel device. But look at the consumer side, how many TVs are in an average house now? When you start getting into these embedded smart TVs, you have 4 or 5 in a house, plus all the other embedded smart appliances that are going to be out there and accessible. Potentially you're looking at the many hundreds of millions of devices out there that are connected to the internet that really haven't made the scorecard on the attack or attack platform or hack platform. But I think we're going to see that become a strong member of these scorecards in the near future.
We were joking, kind of referencing your blog. You had written a sort of a hypothetical story about being betrayed by your refrigerator. And
right.
I recall we were having a conversation kind of jokingly about the notion of, the refrigerator getting infected with some type of a malware and being able to spread that infection to food. Sounds ridiculous. But we were talking about, perhaps food in the future, maybe a bottle of milk, for example, might use nanotechnology to help, chew up the any, types of infection, bacteria or something that it might be forming in the milk and help it to preserve longer. And, perhaps that would be programmable and be able to catch an infection from the refrigerator. So, it's a crazy notion, but obviously as we go forward, we need to be thinking about security because obviously you don't want to be consuming rogue nanobots in the future.
Well, actually, you're closer than you would think because actually there was a researcher over in England who had a chip inserted, for ID. It carried like his credit card number. He could pay with it by just waving his hand over things.
Yeah.
And he had his hand infected with a computer virus because they found that chip was actually vulnerable, and he was able to infect the chip with a virus and then spread it.
And luckily, that device probably wasn't designed to be able to consume or, bad microbes or something like that.
Wait till we get to, where they embed the chip and do direct learning, and they're able to infect your brain from that. So.
Absolutely.
I was going to say, even with the refrigerator, you might not even need to go as high-tech as nanobots. If you could hack into it, just wait till the person leaves and then remotely log into it, shut it down so that it's not keeping things cool anymore, and now your food spoils, and then recool it again before they get home. So they're eating spoiled food and getting sick.
You can keep a person out of a building by that. I'm home with food poisoning.
Let's see who here's really thinking like a hacker. So, actually, that's all very good discussion. I wanted to just sort of as a final note, I think John had sort of put a check mark beside a particular item here. One of the purchase criteria that I look for in devices that have this sort of automation that we're talking about here, certainly network-enabled capabilities, is that it provides the provisions for patching and firmware updates. And it's the first thing I do when I pull something out of the box, whether it be a smartphone or a new router or something along those lines, is check to see what patches are available because, oftentimes they've sat on the shelf for a little while before purchasing. So.
Absolutely. One of my concerns is the companies themselves are generally using that primarily for feature enhancement, and hopefully they're going to start taking security as a feature and make sure that the device is secure. The last thing we need is your TV taking pictures of you and somebody pushed them up on YouTube for you when you weren't aware.
Many companies do take the security patches pretty seriously, but that needs to be a stronger trend. Very good discussion on this, and we could probably go on for hours on it. Let's go ahead to the next topic here. Jim Clausing, you had some discussion about SQL injection activity that's taking place?
Yeah, Brian. We've been made aware of and we're keeping track of an ongoing massive SQL injection attack out there right now. It looks like it probably started somewhere around the first of the month. Not exactly sure what vulnerabilities it is taking advantage of, but a friend of mine, Daniel Sid, is another security researcher, posted a blog article on it yesterday, and At that time, he had noted 180 some odd thousand web pages that were infected that had this script tag injected into the web pages on the a couple hours ago, before we started recording this, I did the same Google search, and it's up over 215,000 now. The domain that is pointing at is nikjju, nikjju.com. It's currently housed on a server in Turkey someplace, and is surfing up some malware to anybody who surfs to those pages. So it's something to be aware of. As I said, I still don't know what vulnerabilities they're using to do the SQL injection into all these pages, whether it's something in the content management system or the blog software or whatever it is. But it's going on. It's infected a lot of pages out there, and there's some conjecture that they're actually going to use it for something serious in the near future. So I wanted to bring it up since in monitoring the situation. We are continuing to monitor the situation. Don't know exactly what's going on behind the scenes, so just be aware of it. Check your logs for connections to that domain, because as far as I can tell, there's nothing legitimate at that domain. It's just recently been registered, so it's something to keep an eye on.
Okay, Jim, hopefully maybe you can clarify this for me a little bit here. It sounds like some web servers are being compromised and web pages injected with, is it a referral or something pointing, or help me understand a little better what that domain name is.
What's being injected into these web pages is a script tag. So it's an embedded link that sends you off to run a script from this other server that's currently located in Turkey, but that could easily move. Mm-hmm. So it's something that kind of gets run by your browser just by surfing to that page, unless you've got something like NoScript on there so that you don't automatically execute these scripts. So these links are they're doing some browser exploits and infecting folks who just surf to the pages where these links have been injected. Okay.
And so it's about 200,000+ web servers that have demonstrated this sort of cross-linking function that's taken place, and end users would be potentially infected by this. And the question is, what will those end users be used to perform as that sort of botnet is collectively assembled, right?
Right. We don't know yet. But as of about 1 p.m. Eastern Time on the 19th, there were over 215,000 pages that had been infected.
Do we have any commonalities between the pages? Are they running WordPress, or do we know what application they might be heading?
We don't know that for sure. I haven't taken a good look at too many of the infected pages. I just used Google as my tool to find out how many were infected. There's still more research that needs to be done, but it's just been getting some attention today, and so I figured I ought to mention it now while it's hot.
Very good news. So not good news in the sense of good news, but certainly good information to have on your belt to be able to pay attention to the fact that certainly websites and web servers are oftentimes used as a exploit mechanism to take advantage of end users. If you're operating a web server, obviously you don't want to be in that position, so be very vigilant about how it's protected, as well as the logs and changes activities. I think we had a pretty lengthy discussion about a similar topic on last week's program, in fact.
Yep.
Very good, Jim. Thank you very much. And with that, let's go ahead and take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. first thing is to show the recent anomalies that we've had over the last week. On the top of the list here is scanning activity in terms of flows and packets. So there are not a lot of sources doing this, but lots of probes taking place on port 36081 TCP. We're going to take a close look at that. It's a little bit entertaining. We've also seen some scanning activity, or what appears to be very closely related to scanning activity on UDP port 19. That's character generator, an old sort of Unix application for debugging purposes. We'll take a look at that. I'm not really sure how security sensitive or how much of a security issue there is there, but at least worthy of being aware of. Some standards here, port 5900 TCP, that's virtual network computing, basically a remote access protocol that's being probed a little more than usual, but is frequently probed. We talked a little bit about actually somewhat at length about port 210. That activity is continuing. We'll take a quick look at that and some of the developments along that line. Port 2967, that's semantic antivirus port. We still have scanning activity there, so we'll take a quick look at what's changed or what's different. There's some activity on port 6257 UDP. This is sources scanning on that port. That's related to WinMX point-to-point file sharing protocol, and we'll take a quick look at that. I don't see that as necessarily as a strong security issue, but it does pop up from time to time in terms of an anomaly. And another one that we've been visiting is, this is actually showing up as port 88 scanning activity. A single source doing this, a variety of other ports associated with it. We'll take a quick look at the development there. And last but not least is port 161 UDP scanning activity. That's SNMP, Simple Network Management Protocol, that's being probed. So with that, let's dig into the port 3681. I have a really confusing looking graph here to show the last 30 days of activity. And specifically, the port 3681 activity is what shows up. Let me see if I can get a better color to draw with here, but it shows up in this lower right-hand corner as, shaded in purple. And the significance of this is that we've had basically one source that's been doing some pretty aggressive scanning on this port over the last, a little more than a week now, and or just about a week, in fact. And there are very clear periods where it stops and starts again, so that tends to trigger some anomalies and such. But in any case, there's some clear emphasis on scanning for this particular port. Now, when I look at other ports that might be associated with this same scanning activity, I saw a pretty strong history here from the last 30 days. There's an obvious hole in the period between, this is dating back to about March 22nd or so, to about the 24th, just a little less than the 24th, 23rd. So there's basically a 2-day lull in that activity. But in any case, most of the scanning activity from the source has actually been against port 65, let me make sure I have this correct. Yes, 6515. 6515, I believe, is associated with McAfee antivirus. It was actually a port used for promulgating or propagating signature updates. So for some reason, there's been some scanning specifically on that port. We've seen in that case that 6515 was being used for basically spamming proxies. They use a vulnerability or a weakness in that protocol, that port, to be able to send spam through those devices, sort of using it as a proxy. And in fact, a lot of these other ports that we see scanning by this source are similarly associated with proxying type activity. So there's a good reason to believe that perhaps this scanning activity for 36081 is also looking for open proxies that we use for perhaps spamming activities or anonymizing other types of activities as well. So all of these ports and not all of this activity, but all of these ports and a good portion of this activity is associated with basically predominantly a source out of China, and then some activity associated with a source in France. And there's also notably some strong correlation between the periods where this port 36081 was being scanned, as well as the 6515, and both of those turning off at the same time and turning back on, which again sort of associates it with a common or at least a commonly controlled source. So interesting activity associated with that. The next one we'll take a quick look at. This is showed up as an anomaly, so I'm reporting it as such. I'm not sure that this is security related, but this is port 19 UDP character generator. Basically, this is a diagnostic tool. You can connect to a particular port, and then it'll send response characters back to you. There are tens of sources doing this activity, basically, scanning trying to activate this port across multiple addresses. And what's a little bit odd about this case is that rather than probing once to each address or a handful of times, it seems as if there are lots of probes to the same address. And that could be completely innocuous, probing activity or diagnostic type activity is taking place. But the significance here is that there are several sources doing it. They all seem to have a very similar traffic profile associated with it, and it is fairly recently changed in profile of activity on the internet overall. Character generator is one of those ports that is recommended that you completely disable on the internet. So anybody that has that port exposed is perhaps making a mistake, and they may in fact be looking for other ports that may be vulnerable. So,
and I know it's security vulnerability. I think Jim does too. There's an old school denial of service attack where you could link Echo and CareGen across to each other, and it could make a continuous stream of traffic between two machines. So I don't know if that's why they're looking for it, but.
Yeah, I was just thinking that to myself. Is there an old school Unix guy out here that's playing around someplace?
Yeah, that's a possibility. I will point out that it is fixed source port activity, but the source port is not a well-known port, so it didn't look like it was one of these feedback type of self-aggravation situations. I was trying to look for a scenario where this might be denial of service, but it doesn't appear to be the case. So at this point, not really known why that is. Just thought I'd bring it forward to pay attention to any activities you see of it. Next one is no real revelations here. This is scanning activity in terms of the number of sources scanning on port 5900 TCP. As I mentioned, this is a remote access protocol similar to remote desktop protocol. Showing the last 60 days of activity. Most of the sources appear to be coming from Indonesia, and I saw that based on ephemeral port information, it seemed to be a combination of Unix-type machines, perhaps Linux machines, and Windows, in fact, more recent Windows machines associated with that. It's a mild increase, merely about 1,000 sources per hour that we've seen very recently, but it is sort of a change in the profile, and the Internet Protect Alert has been posted on that topic. The next item, we've already talked about this a little bit, port 210 TCP, showing the last 30 days of activity. And what we're seeing is most of the sources are coming from China and Korea. There are some in the U.S. as well. The sources that are scanning on this port also seem to be scanning port 23, so possibly looking for a vulnerable port. John had talked about this a little bit earlier. This may be related to a botnet of webcams, and there's some pretty strong evidence to suggest that may be the case. So if you have webcams or if you have any indication of port 210 activity taking place, you're going to want to pay attention to that. Next item is port 2967. This is associated with Symantec antivirus. There was a vulnerability years ago related to this. Presumably has been fixed up, patched, and replaced by now. But there is basically, in this case, most of the probes. This is not the only source, but most of the probes are coming from a single source in Thailand. And there is another address from Russia that appears to be doing this probing. The graph shows 180 days of activity, and as I've been reporting for several weeks now, the activity is very sporadic, although there seems to have been an uptick in the aggressiveness of that scanning since about March, the beginning of March. So, again, if there's any chance that there's a machine hanging out there that has been patched since I have to think it's around 2007 or 2008 since this vulnerability has been discovered, you certainly want to pay attention to Next one here, I'm showing the last 90 days of activity, and this is has the profile. It has all of the characteristics of point-to-point activity, which is consistent with this protocol. This is port 6257 UDP. That's the WinMX application, which is a point-to-point file sharing application. There are participants in Europe mostly, some in the U.S. and Japan as well. So there's a fairly strong profile in terms of the participants, fairly strong profile in terms of the number of participants and the when this activity is taking place. But as the graph clearly shows, this activity turns on and turns off for the recent period where it had turned off and then turned back on. So it raised itself as an anomaly. And so with that said, we don't have a strong security relationship associated with this other than generally in an enterprise, point-to-point applications are considered to be frowned upon. And secondly, the fact that it is turning on and turning off is something that makes us a little bit suspect. So again, port 6257 UDP is something you might want to at least have some understanding of how it's being used if it is being used in your environment. Next item here is increased scanning activity on port 88 TCP, and this is attributable to a sort of a growing friend of ours. We've called this the rainbow graph. It's a single source from China, and it is also associated with scanning activity on several ports, port 88, port 90, port 8081, port 8086, port 8088, lots of 80s here. Port 8089, port 8090, and port 8888. And basically the graph below shows different colors for each of those ports, and you can see over time it has a very similar profile and a very similar sort of periodicity associated with it. This is scanning around, and again, very similar to the previous one that we had talked about. We presume looking for open proxies that can be perhaps used for spamming activities or anonymizing for other perhaps nefarious purposes. All right, the next item here is scanning activity on, this is increase in scanning activity in port 161 UDP. This is Simple Network Management Protocol. And basically what we're seeing is an increase in scanning activity. It's actually from a single source in Brazil that we've seen most recently doing this. I wouldn't describe it as particularly aggressive scanning, but certainly network management protocol is one that you want to pay attention to. Now, one of the concerns or controversies that's developing related to SNMP is that, a single packet request to an SNMP-enabled device can respond with several packets or many packets, and that can be used in denial of service attacks, which is an undesirable behavior. So certainly if you're aware of any SNMP devices that are exposed to the internet, you certainly want to close those down or restrict what addresses should have access to it if you need it for management purposes. For the next item, let's take a look at briefly the most probed ports on the internet over the last week or so. And what we have at the top of the list, as usual, is port 445, followed by 1433 TCP. The combination of those is representing perhaps about 25% of the total scanning activity on the network, followed by perhaps maybe 20 or 15% of the activity in terms of probes on port 80 TCP, and then again followed by some other standards that we are used to seeing, port 3389, that's remote desktop protocol, port 22, that's SSH, 6515 we talked about earlier, which was that probing activity looking for, in fact, for the most part, I think attributed to a single source, probing for the McAfee antivirus sharing port. And then we see this port 36081 TCP and port 8080 TCP as well. Next and last on the list here, we have the pie chart relative to the most sources that are doing the probing. Far and above, perhaps almost 50% of the probing, I'll say 45% of the probing is sources they're probing are associated with port 445 TCP, followed by activity on port 23 TCP, port 5900 TCP, which we talked about, 1562, which I believe is also a remote PC access application, port 80 TCP that we talked about, 3389, remote desktop protocol, and some others that are a little less significant, with trailing in the back here, port 135 TCP, which is a one that's traditionally associated with Microsoft Net BIOS. And with that, I'll go ahead and check to see if there are any final comments from the group here. All right, I want to thank you folks for joining us today. Jim Boxmeyer, Jim Clausing, and John Hogoboom, thank you for your input and discussion. And for the folks that are watching or listening, certainly we welcome your input, your feedback. Again, you can contact us through email at cyberthreat@list.att.com. This program is available on the AT&T Tech channel. That's techchannel.att.com. Just look for the under our shows, look for the AT&T Cyber Threat Report. It's also available on YouTube. There's an AT&T Tech channel on YouTube. You can search for that. And similarly, it's available from FeedBurner as well as iTunes. Just search for the AT&T Cyber Threat Report. And as always, we are very thankful for your watching, your viewing, or your listening, and we bid you to keep your network safe.